Thank you very much, Noah. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's good to be here, all of us together. These are very intense times, tumultuous times, and it's coming together, actually, that we can face our adversity, to take the challenge and use it as an opportunity for transformation. One feature of that is sometimes actually to, in a sense, be able to let go, to relax, to not get too caught up in a kind of grip, so to speak, of the moment, to have a sense of clarity and stability. So that let's just do a very basic kind of practice just for the first few minutes here until about 15 minutes after the hour. And I just invite you first to find a seat, a comfortable seat. I'm going to take my glasses off. If you're sitting in a chair, you might find it best to have your feet flat on the floor. Just a sense of the earth holding us up naturally. Mother Earth holds us, whether we want her to or not. She simply holds us. We can relax and be held by the earth. And then perhaps lifting the shoulders just to bring in some breath and out. Just letting go. Perhaps one more time. And now I invite you to just allow your mind to settle on something, perhaps the sensations of breathing. Nothing to figure out, no need to fixate on it, just let the mind ride on the breath. As thoughts arise, simply notice them as thoughts. Sensations are simply sensations. And then let go. Even as the mind attends to the breath, there's a sense of openness, spaciousness, a feeling of being where you are now. Even while the mind is on an object, there's an awareness of much more. See if you can just let go a little and open to that awareness. There's no need to make anything happen, no need to stop thoughts. Simply be aware, not lost, undistracted. Let the breath be like an anchor or like something floating in the water, your hand gently on it, just keeping track, but aware of much more. Notice how almost out of the corner of the eye, so to speak, you can be aware of your environment, even while the mind is watching the breath, a sense of the body, a sense of being in a space. And letting go now even more, perhaps, as if letting go of that buoy in the water, letting go a little of the anchor. Drop even the attention to the breath. Just be aware of that spaciousness, sense of being where you are, of being in the world and connected to the world. If you feel distracted, come back to the breath and then gently let go again. So naturally connected, the awareness of just being here, so to speak, in this place where you are, in the world, connected. Let's bring up now our intention for being here together. Recalling perhaps our motivation, these difficult times, coming together to face the challenges, to transform ourselves and the world. And settling into that motivation, let's begin our day together. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think this is really important at this time for us to create the opportunities for these exhales. Al, I'd so appreciate it if you would introduce Jonathan Schooler.
Thank you, Roshi. And Jonathan, thank you for being part of the faculty. This morning, we're going to hear from Jonathan. The title of his talk is Reflecting on consciousness, on the distinction between experience and meta-awareness. And I think as some of you who are with us today know, this is really an area in which Jonathan has extraordinary expertise, an area that he's done a great deal of work in. So we're very grateful that he's here with us today. Jonathan, please go ahead.
Share my screen. Let's see. It says disabled attendee screen sharing. So I'll be needed.
So Ignacio, you have to enable. Oh, here we go. I can do it. Okay. See if it works now, Jonathan.
Yeah, that looks good. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great.
And Jonathan, welcome. And we're also happy to be welcomed into your backyard in Santa Barbara. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure and such an honor to be here today. This pandemic has been very trying for all of us, and especially for some. But at the same time, it's also an opportunity. For many of us, it's an opportunity to be in our own spaces, to be quiet, to reflect, to take stock of our lives and our experience, and to really contemplate what that experience is. So as much as it is a very, very difficult time, it is also a timely opportunity to take stock of our experience. And that's what I want to be talking about today. I want to be talking about this process of taking stock, of observing our experience. Let me begin with something that Chuck Schreiber and I have referred to as the paradox of introspection. And the paradox of introspection comes from this sort of remarkable way in which consciousness is so self-evident and yet also elusive. And let me quotes by dead white men that capture this this paradox. So Brentano pointed out that experience is self-evident. No one can doubt whether the psychic conditions he apprehends in himself be and be so as he apprehends it. So in a certain sense, there is a way in which our experience is absolutely self-evident. Even if you are experiencing a giant pink elephant in the room, that experience is what it is. So on the one hand, it seems that experience is self-evident. This is really Descartes' famous line, I think, therefore I am. It is just the essential truth of our existence. But at the same time that we have this essential truth, there's also this fundamental challenge of introspection. Our ability to notice and characterize our experience is often suspect. As the philosopher Comte said, the thinker cannot divide himself into two, of whom one reasons whilst the other observes his reason. And as my all-time favorite, both philosopher and psychologist William James observed, the attempt at introspective analysis in these cases is in fact like seizing a spinning top to catch its motion, or trying to turn up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness looks. So there's this challenge. On the one hand, experience is self-evident, and yet on the other hand, our ability to fully capture that experience is as challenging as seizing a spinning top to capture its motion. So how do we reconcile this paradox? I'm not going to claim to have entirely solved the paradox today, but I do want to offer a perspective that I think can offer some insight into this challenge. And in so doing, it also provides us a way to think about our relationship to our understanding of our own experience. The fundamental premise is that one can consciously have an experience of something without being meta-conscious of having that experience. So that experience is always happening. We are always having some experience. But this idea of meta-consciousness or meta-awareness, and I'll be unpacking that through today's talk, is more fleeting, more elusive, and more prone to error and distortion. Okay, let me unpack this claim for you, and then we can talk about some of the research that I and my colleagues have done on it, and then explore some of its implications. So the basic idea, let me back up for a second. Typically, when we talk about consciousness, we talk about two levels. We talk about things either being conscious or being unconscious. So we have the non-conscious or unconscious processes. These are all the things that are going below the surface of experience. The spreading activation that they talk about in cognitive psychology of all sorts of associations that are going on really below the surface of awareness, all the processes that contribute to where the next thought comes from, and so on. Lots of processes are going on entirely below the surface of awareness. And then, of course, we have experiential consciousness, or simply experience, which is what is ever occupying our mind at any particular time. And these two dimensions, ways that we talk about it. But I would like to argue today that there's a third level. And this third level can be called meta-consciousness or meta-awareness. And it's our explicit understanding of the current contents of experience. It is that moment where you realize what you're thinking or what you're feeling. And the claim is that this meta-consciousness or meta-awareness is not necessarily going on all the time, that we periodically enter that particular state. Let me flesh this distinction out in the context of an example that everybody is all too familiar with. Oftentimes when I talk about this, I'll ask the group, how many of you are familiar with the experience of reading along something that you are significantly interested in paying attention to? You're reading along, and suddenly you realize that although your eyes have been moving across the page, your mind is completely elsewhere. And what I enjoy about this example is routinely this evokes a room full of sheepish grins as everybody sort of acknowledges that, yes, this happens to them all the time. And it seems to be a ubiquitous experience. You'll be reading along and then boom, wait, where was I? How did I just do this? So in the context of mind wandering while reading, we can see these three levels of consciousness at play. We have first, the non-conscious processes. So as you're reading, even when you're mind wandering, you're still processing those words, and those words are activating associated words, and there's a whole behind the scenes process that's taking place. In addition, there's experiential consciousness. This is whatever you are mind wandering about, that upcoming trip to Apaya, or when are you going to be allowed out to see your friends and family. All these thoughts that may be occupying you instead of actually attending to what you're reading. And then as your eyes move across the page and your mind is wandering, suddenly there's this moment of, oh, I've done it again. There's this moment of meta-awareness or meta-consciousness where you suddenly realize that you're mind wandering instead of reading. I find that the example of this is very compelling, because if you knew that you were mind wandering, you would have stopped. Everybody understands that when they're reading, if they're thinking about something completely unrelated, they're not going to be able to comprehend the material, and yet we still do it. And so the explanation for why we do this thing, which we know is entirely self-defeating, is because we haven't noticed that we do it. Well, mind wandering is one, or mind wandering while reading is one situation where this plays itself out, but it also plays out in the context of meditating. All of you who have meditated have surely had the experience of having the very firm intention of focusing on the breath, of holding the mind on the breath and really keeping the attention there. And yet, periods of time, it's hard to know how long, but significant periods of time can pass where you start mind wandering and you haven't noticed that you've completely lost track of the breath. And then there's that moment of going, oh, I've done it again. How did I just lose track of my breath for all that time? And then hopefully you gently bring yourself back to the breath. And so meta-awareness is this moment of noticing that our mind is wandering, and in the context of meditating, hopefully gently bringing the breath back. So all of you are familiar experientially with the experience of meta-awareness, but perhaps haven't thought about its implications or how it plays into your life, or what it means. So now what I'd like to do, now that hopefully you have the basic idea, which is really quite intuitive, I hope, let's talk about the ways in which meta-awareness can become separated from consciousness. And I refer to this as dissociations of meta-awareness. Actually, before that, let me just show you this, this model. This is a model that came out in the journal Trends in Cognitive Science. And here it's a very simple model. Basically, the idea is that throughout the day, we are engaging in basic consciousness or experiential consciousness. This is just whatever is occupying us, and tacit monitoring. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then only periodically do we become metaconscious. So this is one of the key ideas, that metaconsciousness is intermittent. At the very end of my talk, I'll talk about some work that John Dunn, Evan Thompson, and I have been doing, where we've been thinking that there may be another kind of meta-awareness that is actually more continuous. And it's actually a very exciting prospect, because if you can cultivate this more continuous kind of meta-awareness, that may be very helpful for enabling us to remain present in our experiences. But for now, let's focus on the kind of meta-awareness that I've been talking about, where you suddenly and intermittently realize something is occupying your mind. Okay, so to reiterate some of these points, there's this unconscious tacit monitoring of cognitions. And you might ask, what's that? How does my mind monitor itself without even being conscious of it? And let me give you an example, which I think is really kind of a fun one. And this is the example of eye movements during reading. When people are reading, their eyes move from word to word to word to word, but they don't just fixate the same amount on every word. They fixate differentially depending on the frequency of the word. High frequency words have smaller fixations, where low frequency words have longer fixations. Why is that? Because essentially we have an unconscious monitoring system which is deciding when it understands the word and moves the eyes to the next word in turn. So you're constantly, your mind is, your brain, mind, whatever we want to call it here, is constantly appraising its understanding and then taking in new information accordingly. And this is going on entirely behind the scenes. You don't think to yourself, okay, I got this word, now I can read the next word. I've got that word, now I can read the next word. No, all of this monitoring of understanding is going on behind the scenes. So the idea is that we have this whole very elaborate monitoring system. Other things, the timing that we have for when we decide to say the next thing in relationship to other people, so many complex monitoring things are taking place all the time behind the scenes. And then we have conscious experience. Conscious experience is at the same time it's one of the most challenging things for science, and yet it's the thing that we are most intimately aware of. From the moment we wake up in the morning till the time that we fall asleep at night, we are having conscious experience. It is simply what is occupying our awareness, our experience at every moment. And then we have meta-awareness, at least the kind that I'm talking about right now. And this is things like noticing lapses, thinking about your emotional state. If I ask you, what's going on in your mind right now? That would invoke meta-awareness. Natural introspection is another example of meta-awareness. But critically, it's not continuous, it's intermittent. So what are some of the characteristics of meta-awareness? Here we have a little meditator with a moment of meta-awareness here. In those, with respect to meta-awareness, it's limited. So it's not like when you're meta-aware, suddenly you know everything that's going on in your experience. You may have meta-awareness of one aspect. Shoot, I just mind wandered again, but perhaps you haven't noticed that you're feeling stressed or some other aspect. So meta-awareness, like consciousness itself, is limited in its nature. It's also retrospective. You're typically, shoot, I was just mind wandering. It's typically taking stock of what had just occurred to you, perhaps just moments before. And also, and I'll be talking more about this in a moment, it tends to be verbal. It tends to be some kind of internalized statements such as, oh, I'm feeling angry, or I just mind wandered, or perhaps a positive thing, perhaps, wow, I'm elated. I'm finally feeling relaxed. Many of these different types of sort of verbal characterizations of our experience correspond to the verbal symbolic content of meta-awareness. Okay. So now let me turn to this idea about the dissociations of meta-awareness. Here, the idea is that because meta-awareness is only intermittent, whereas experience is continuous, there are ways in which the two can become unhinged that are quite interesting. And I'd like to talk about two ways in which meta-awareness becomes separated from the contents of experience. The first, and perhaps these terms have never really caught on, so it may be that we need to come up with better terms for these ideas, but the ideas I think are straightforward. The first I've called a temporal dissociation, and this is the idea of experience in the absence of meta-awareness. So this is the example of mind wandering while reading, or mind wandering while meditating and not realizing it. So you're engaging in an activity and you haven't noticed that that's what you're doing. Another classic example is driving past your exit towards some other destination without having noticed that that's what you're doing. And then meta-awareness is that moment where you suddenly go, oh, I've been mind wandering. Oh, I've driven past the exit. Then another kind, and this is perhaps a more controversial kind, and one for which there are other interpretations, but I think the claim that I want to make here is a defensible one, is that what meta-awareness is it's a translation of our experience to ourselves. It's a narrative that we are creating about what's going on in our mind at any particular time. And so, as with any time in which we try to translate something, there's the possibility of some type of misrepresentation. So a translation dissociation entails a re-representing of consciousness where we embellish, distort, or neglect aspects of our experience. So the idea is that sometimes we can take stock of our experience and yet in some way or another get it wrong. The example of shouting, "I'm not angry," would be a good example of a translation dissociation. You're reflecting on your experience, but you're denying that you're experiencing anger. Although if you're shouting it, clearly you are. All right. So that's the overview of this model. And typically at this time, I would pause and ask if people have any questions, but we won't do that now. But let me invite you to just sort of reflect to yourself on, where might you have confusion, and perhaps as I go through it, some of those confusions will clarify. And if not, hopefully we'll have an opportunity for discussion later. So let's talk about one area where we started doing research on this idea of meta-awareness, and that's in the context of mind wandering while reading. It is really a exemplification of a temporal dissociation. It's clear that the contents of mind wandering are conscious, and yet it's extremely difficult to explain why you would continue to read if you are aware of the fact that you're mind wandering. And you can sort of reflect on this yourself. When you're mind wandering while reading, routinely, you just haven't noticed that that's what you're doing. And you, in a sense, wake up with meta-awareness and go, oh, I've done it again. So in an initial study on this, 18 years ago, we brought people into the lab and we had them read War and Peace. We had them read chapters of War and Peace presented word at a time. And one of our big discoveries is that people mind wander a lot while they're reading War and Peace. So they read War and Peace, and then as they were reading it, we asked them to track their mind wandering, but we did it in two different ways. In one condition, or not in one condition, in one way of doing it is self-catching. So we just asked them to press a button every time that they noticed that they were mind wandering. Well, if you press a button indicating that you are mind wandering, then clearly it's reached meta-awareness, right? That's what meta-awareness is. It's this self-realization of a particular state of mind is going on. But in addition to asking them to catch themselves mind wander, periodically at random times, we would probe them and go, just now, were you mind wandering? So I could do that just now, were you mind wandering? Right now, I don't know exactly how many, but we've got, wow, I don't want to think about how many participants we have. We have quite a few participants. A number of them were probably just mind wandering when I asked you, were you mind wandering, right? So you can catch people mind wandering even when they are thinking about meta-awareness, even when they're thinking about how they're trying to pay attention. So my guess is, welcome back to those of you who I may have just caught. So the question is, when you catch someone mind wandering with this ping, when they've been trying to notice it themselves, this is mind wandering without meta-awareness. Here they are trying to tend to their mind, and yet we're catching them without them noticing it. And what we found was that we routinely caught people mind wandering before they had noticed it themselves. So routinely, people mind wander without meta-awareness. And in addition, we looked at the relationship between mind wandering and reading comprehension, which interestingly, even though everybody does it at this time, no one had actually examined this. And it turns out that mind wandering while reading is a major source of reading comprehension. But the relationship to reading comprehension depends on the kind of meta-awareness. So when people self-catch their mind wandering themselves, the frequency of that is not associated with reading comprehension, because if you're catching your own mind wandering, well, then you can go back, you can repair, you can take care of what you missed and redo it. But if you're mind wandering and you haven't noticed it, mind wandering without meta-awareness, then it's really problematic. So it's the unaware mind wandering that seems to really be disruptive for people. And we've done lots of different studies that is suggestive of that. And also looking into the brain activation. Research with Kalina Christoph will be speaking tomorrow shows that when people are mind wandering without meta-awareness, it has a much more sort of absorbing and differential pattern of brain activation relative to when people are mind wandering with meta-awareness. So this technique of pinging people and catching them without meta-awareness is powerful. We can now ask the question, are there ways of knocking out meta-awareness? And how does that affect people's performance? Well, how can we knock out meta-awareness? One technique, which many people take advantage of in order to sort of escape from the reflections of introspection, is alcohol. So in this study, we replicated the reading paradigm that I described before. So people are reading War and Peace, but we've added a new twist. We've given them, some participants, alcohol. We've gave it to them in a format which was where they received either alcohol or a placebo, which just had a little bit of a smell of alcohol in the lime. So everybody thought they were consuming alcohol. And it's actually quite interesting. My colleague, Michael Sayet, who was the lead author on this, has done research on it. And when you give people placebo alcohol, they get drunk. They will start laughing and becoming boisterous. It turns out that a big portion of the impact of alcohol is just believing that you are receiving it. But even though everybody thought that they had consumed alcohol, we did then investigate its impact on meta-awareness. And we found some very interesting things, which actually have implications, I think, for understanding why alcohol is so problematic in situations like driving. So what we found is it doubled the frequency that we caught people with the probes mind wandering. So they are mind wandering twice as often in the alcohol condition relative to the no alcohol condition. So it's increasing lapses, and yet at the very same time, it's decreasing meta-awareness. They're less likely to notice themselves mind wandering. So you can see that alcohol sort of packs this 1-2 punch. It increases lapses, and yet it reduces the awareness of them. And so it may be that it's this 1-2 punch, which is why it can be so problematic when people are driving or using heavy machinery and so on. As I mentioned before, one of the key assumptions of this approach is that mind wandering, that meta-awareness is associated with language, with inner speech. And in one study conducted by Michael Bastian, we had people, again, the same basic paradigm in which they are reading, and then we either probe them or self-catch them. But in addition, we asked them, to what degree were you experiencing inner speech? And we found that the self-caught mind wandering was much more likely to involve inner speech than the probe caught. Again, suggesting that mind wandering, that meta-awareness may be associated with inner speech. So now the question is, what can we do to facilitate meta-awareness? Are there techniques that we can develop that will help us to become better able to notice what's going on in our own minds, and in turn, to catch ourselves mind wandering and then bring ourselves back to whatever the task is at hand? So in a study led by my then graduate student, Michael Mrazek, who is now the director of research at our Center for Mindfulness and Human Potential here at UCSB, we had participants assigned to one of two conditions. They were either assigned to a 2-week mindfulness course or to a nutrition course. And in both cases, they were given sort of strong expectations that this was going to be very helpful for them. Both before and after these courses, we gave them a number of different measures that assessed their tendency to mind wander and also their meta-awareness. We gave them a working memory task, which is basically a task that measures how well they're able to hold information in mind. And we gave them a reading task in which we had them read sort of GRE types of questions and indicate how, then do a comprehension measure later on. And as in the previous studies that I've told you about, we had them indicate when they notice themselves mind wandering, and then we also ping them periodically to see if we could catch them ourselves. And what we found, this is a rather busy slide here, but essentially what we found is that the mindfulness intervention significantly, if you compare the pre-test to the post-test, you can see that there was an improvement in their reading performance, no improvement in the nutrition. There was improvement in their working memory performance. There was a reduction in probe-caught mind wandering. And in this case, there was also a reduction in self-caught mind wandering. And the interesting thing here is that the improvement in performance in both the working memory and in the reading and working memory conditions was statistically mediated by a reduction in mind wandering. So the reason why the mindfulness training seems to have been helpful is because it seems to have facilitated people's ability to stay focused, to stay on task, and as I'll show in another study, to become aware of their mind wandering. Another study that we've done to examine the impact of mind wandering, the impact of meditation on meta-awareness and mind wandering was done in collaboration with Alan Wallace and the Shamatha Project. Many of you may have heard about this project. It was a very ambitious and quite remarkable project in which they had a number of participants in a 3-month intensive meditation retreat, and then gave them a whole number, batteries of different types of measures, both before the retreat and after the retreat, to see what changes had been done. And they also did a 7-year follow-up. There was also a second study that I had the honor of participating in both of these and examining people's mind wandering both before and after this meditation retreat. We did 2 studies. I'm just going to tell you about one of them today. So in this study, we used a kind of fun technique for measuring mind wandering, which entails gibberish detection. So the idea is that people are reading text that periodically the words become out of order. And the question is, how long do they continue advancing the text as if they're understanding it when it's making no sense? So first, let me show you what it would look like if it made sense. They might be reading something, and this was a children's book, so it should have been very clear when it goes awry. So this is what it might have looked like initially, or we must make some money for the circus, said ability. Makes sense. You just keep advancing along. But now periodically they could read this sentence, but in a different way. They're reading in a whole children's book, incidentally. How can, and but here's another example where it turns to gibberish. We must make some circus for the money. Well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. So the idea is, how long do they continue pressing the button, indicating that they're reading along, when in fact it's just all the words have been moved around, or actually we move nouns, we switch the nouns around so that they're in the wrong place. And we can ask, how long did they continue advancing the text when it's no longer making any sense? And here we have the results of the shamatha study. This is the performance, the mean number of words until gibberish was detected in the pre-test, in the post-test, and in a 7-year follow-up, suggesting that people learned during this task, during this 3-month period, to become more focused, and that they were able to take that skill set and actually carry it on 7 years later. In addition to using gibberish detection, we also included the self-caught and probe-caught mind-wandering techniques. And what we found was that there was a reduction in probe-caught mind-wandering. And in this study, we did the analysis slightly differently. We asked, given the reduced level with which people are mind-wandering, how often are they catching themselves mind-wandering? And we found here an increase in the ratio of self-caught to probe-caught mind-wandering. In other words, even though people are mind-wandering less, they're relatively more likely to notice their mind-wandering. So the shamatha study also provided evidence that the course, that this 3-month experience of contemplative practice was facilitating people's ability to engage in meta-awareness, to notice their meta-awareness. So it suggests that training reduces the frequency of mind wandering, but increases the ability to notice it. Okay, let's see. In terms of, we've talked about now the temporal dissociations. Now I want to take just a few minutes and talk about translation dissociations, really just do some hand waving at that. So as I mentioned, translation dissociations of meta-awareness are where, when we attempt to take stock of our experience, we realize, we attempt to take stock of our experiences and we don't get it right. So shouting, "I'm not angry," would be an example. And there have been a number of different examples that suggest that translation dissociations do take place. One place that we found it is if something's very ambiguous, if the cues are very subtle, if it's hard to read what's going on, that may be a situation in which people are going to be less likely to be accurately aware of their own state. Another thing seems to be repression. There's a class of people known as repressors who report that they're not feeling stress, even though if you look at physiological measures, suggest that they really are. And lastly, a non-verbalizability. There are experiences that are hard to put into words. And we've done a fair bit of research indicating that when you attempt to translate your non-verbal experiences into words, you can actually distort them. A number of examples of this. One is research on something that I've called verbal overshadowing. And in this case, people see a face, and then in one condition, they're asked to describe it in as much detail as possible. So that would be arguably in a moment of meta-awareness, where they're trying to take stock of the contents of that memory of their face. And then we look at people's ability to recognize the face in a lineup. And what we find is that people are actually less accurate at recognizing faces when they've engaged in this reflective activity. So meta-awareness is actually distorting their memory for the face. We found this with faces, we found this with colors, shapes, tastes, voices, musics, maps. In other domains of nonverbal cognition, such as jam, people, when they analyze why they felt the way they did about a strawberry jam, they're actually less in keeping with expert ratings on the jams. And we've even found it with inside problem solving. People thought out loud while trying to solve inside problems. It interfered with their performance. There are probably a number of different factors that contribute to this verbal overshadowing effect. But one key idea here is that when you're attempting to translate your experiences into words, you can actually get it wrong. You can distort the experience in significant ways, and that can lead to these types of distortions. Okay, there are a number of looming questions that we can ask about meta-awareness. What are the neurocognitive underpinnings of meta-awareness? As I mentioned, my friend and colleague, Lena Christoph, has spent time thinking about that, and perhaps we'll be talking about that in her talk. Is meta-awareness necessarily propositional? Is it necessarily intermittent? Evan Thompson and John Dunn and I have talked about mindful meta-awareness and the possibility that we may be able to cultivate a particular kind of meta-awareness which is going on at the same time as we're having experiences, so that we can know that we're attending as we are attending. We think this is a really exciting sort of variation on meta-awareness that really has a lot of potential. And then lastly, I want to leave you with this idea of what a concept that my partner Amanda Gregory and I have been referring to as open mindfulness. And here the idea is that mindfulness and meta-awareness are wonderful things, but can we combine them with this other wonderful trait to make this just really powerful quality? The idea is that we can take mindfulness and mix it with something known as openness to experience. Openness to experience is one of the big 5 personality traits. It is a quality that everybody has to varying degrees, and it entails a number of characteristics that I think many of you will agree are characteristics to cultivate, including being creative to new ideas. So having an active imagination, being intrigued by art and nature, experiencing a wide range of emotions and feelings, enjoying playing with theories or abstract ideas, curiosity, this is one that we could use a lot of in today's world, being broad-minded and tolerant of other people's lifestyles and opinions, and being interested in developing and learning new hobbies. It's associated with many really important qualities, such as creativity, career advancement, metacognitive awareness, intellectual humility, curiosity, and even longevity. Openness to experience is basically like being young at heart. As people get older, oftentimes they show a decrease in openness to experience. And so cultivating openness to experience may actually, in a certain sense, be a kind of fountain of youth. But clearly, it has limitations. One key element of openness to experience is daydreaming, which can lead to distraction. And openness to experience can be associated with recklessness, right? You don't necessarily want to be open to the experience of riding a motorcycle without a helmet. You need to be discerning. And so the idea that we are exploring is if we could cultivate openness to experience and simultaneously cultivate mindfulness, we could get sort of the best of both sides. So this leads us to the concept of what we're calling open mindfulness, which is cultivating open to experience along with mindfulness. And the idea is that you get the creativity of openness and the awareness of mindfulness. And together, this may be a really lovely virtue to develop. So just in the last minute or two, I'd like to give you just a brief experience of the kind of approach that we're taking to it. The basic idea is that if you can introduce people to novel, rewarding experiences, that they will learn that it's valuable to try new things. Go to a paya for the first time. Do something that you haven't done before. Try a recipe that you haven't done. Listen to a kind of music you haven't listened to before. So, and that's one of the approaches that we're really critically depending on, is this new sound experiences. And so what I'd like to do is just give you a moment, or maybe a minute or two, I'll give you an experience. Let me tell you now that we are going to be offering a full hour of this, what we're now referring to as meta music. My partner, Amanda Gregory, will be doing a performance at, I guess it'll be 8 p.m. Mountain Time, 7 p.m. Pacific Time. If you go to the information sheet on the website and look under me, you'll see an announcement that leads you to a link that will allow you to join us. Please wear headphones. Let me just give you a sample of the kind of experience that we're playing with. And what I'd like you to do is to use this musical sound as the ground, in the same way that you would use the breath as the ground when you are meditating. So the idea is that this is going to be this unusual experience, and just allow your awareness to follow the sound as it moves through space. She plays a lot with spatialization, and it really allows you to sort of lose yourself and hold the sound as the ground. So let's just see if we can make this work. If you can wear headphones, I recommend it. Let's see here. Okay. Can you, everyone can still see me good. So that gives you a feeling of the experience that we've been playing with. Again, I encourage you to join us this evening at 8 p.m. if you'd like to explore more of that. Let me close by thanking you all for participating. I hope that you can take some of the ideas that I've talked about in exploring your own meta-awareness, cultivating your meta-awareness, and potentially also finding opportunities to cultivate the expanded application of meta-awareness to open mindfulness and learning to combine both the awareness and focus that arises from mindfulness practices, and also the openness to experience that can arise from trying new experiences and cultivating them. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you didn't mind water too much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Really such fascinating work. We're going to have the opportunity for some discussion now for just a little under a half hour, and then we'll have a break after that. We're going to have, I'll start off with asking something of Jonathan, and then we're going to let the faculty have a little bit of time for asking some things, and then from the participants, the Q&A you've been sending, I've been making some notes, and we'll try to bring together some of those threads as well. So Jonathan, first off, I'm fascinated by the kind of thinking that you and John Dunn and colleagues have been doing about this possibility of ongoing rather than intermittent meta-awareness. And I'm curious about your take or your hypothesis about how that fits with another kind of perspective about cognition that's been traditional in some adjacent work, and that is that we're really limited channel capacity organisms. And so we're really incapable of multitasking. We oscillate between, say, two tasks or two thought streams. So when we're presumably in some continuous meta-awareness, are we actually flickering back and forth between primary awareness and that meta-awareness, or are we underestimating the capacity for the scope of awareness in the way that maybe John Dunn was suggesting in our meditation practice, that we can actually open up awareness a little more broadly?
Thank you. That's a great and difficult question, and I'm delighted that I have my colleague John Dunn here who may want to add to it. What I would say is that I think that one of the reasons why this mindful meta-awareness is so difficult is precisely for the reason that you've said. We get so absorbed in our experiences that we don't have the bandwidth to be able to maintain meta-awareness at the same time. But that particularly in something like a contemplative practice where you are holding your focus in some relatively constrained way, that there then may be room to hold meta-awareness simultaneously with the thing that you are attending to, be it the breath or the other grounding object. So I think it is quite possible. Now, it must be said that there was long debates in cognitive psychology about whether or not search was parallel versus serial, and almost every parallel process can be mimicked with the serial process that's moving back and forth. In the olden days when we had the television sets, we would have a single point that was moving electron that was going up and down the screen. It appeared as if it was parallel, but it was really just in one place at any particular time. So it may be difficult to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that we're not just flickering back and forth. But I think conceptually, if the demands of the primary task are relatively constrained, that including meta-awareness in that is quite plausible. John, is there anything more you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. This is a really important and great question, Al. And I'd say that kind of at a kind of the phenomenology of practicing where one's trying to ramp up one's capacity for meta-awareness. And one way of thinking about this is that the explicit meta-awareness that Jonathan's talking about is dependent on some kind of a monitoring that, as Jonathan said, could be behind the scenes. And part of maybe some styles of meditation practice, like the one I was trying to do a little bit of this morning, is to try to kind of get behind the scenes, like be a little more backstage, so to speak, and have and kind of ramp up the capacity, put more cognitive mojo, so to speak, into the meta-awareness channel, if you like, which seems to be phenomenologically in practice, that when you have, that's why we don't focus so hard on the object. You actually have to sort of let go of the object in some sense to be able to be more behind the scenes, if you like. And I'll try to say more about that maybe during my talk, or maybe it'll come up more in the discussion. But I do want to give an example of something that is a very interesting case of something that's like, that we discussed briefly in our paper, that may be a good example of this kind of meta-awareness, which is lucid dreaming. So that when you're lucid dreaming, a very interesting feature of lucid dreaming is if you think, oh, I'm dreaming, it actually wakes you up very often. And part of the reason, one way of understanding that is that it's the attention to the dream that sustains it. So that if you stop paying attention to the dream and you start paying attention to your experience, in other words, you do a kind of explicit meta-awareness, and you keep doing that, the attention, the introspective attention to your experience makes the dream dissipate because you're not paying attention to it anymore. And that's why you wake up. So instead of that, like experienced lucid dreamers, even while they're in the dream, are not actually introspecting like, oh, I'm dreaming, I'm dreaming. That may happen initially, but actually they're sort of in an ongoing way aware that they're in a dream. It presents itself as a dream. It feels like a dream, so to speak. And yet they are not explicitly thinking, I am dreaming, I am dreaming. So this is an example of a case. So one way of thinking about this is that there isn't the same kind of cognitive conflict, because while in the dream experience, let's say I'm seeing an elephant, so that's being presented as a kind of object. It's what I'm knowing, but there's also an aspect of that experience, which is how I am knowing it, which in this case would be, I am knowing it in a dream, as a dream entity. So there's the what of the knowing and the how, and those two may not really be in conflict cognitively. So that's one way of thinking about how maybe we do have a kind of capacity for a sustained, ongoing kind of meta-awareness that sometimes maybe is actually unconscious. Is that even meta-awareness anymore? It's something that's really all the way in the background, but maybe certain styles of practice can bring it more to the foreground, and that could be very useful for various purposes like emotion regulation.
So John, I'm gonna, just so our translators can keep up with your
Oh, yes, sorry. Lo
lightning
siento mucho.
mind. Yeah,
No
your
puedo
lightning
hablarlo en
mind.
español.
Have mercy on them.
Lo
Forgive
siento
me.
mucho. Mis amigos españoles, lo siento mucho.
Thank you so much, John and Jonathan. Richie had a question he wanted to pose, so why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself, Richie?
Thank you all, and thank you, Jonathan, for the wonderful presentation. I really loved it a lot, and I just really appreciate all the work you're doing. And I also can't help but comment on this last little stream before I ask my question. It may well be that a distinction you introduced, Jonathan, between kind of verbal propositional meta-awareness and perhaps more nonverbal meta-awareness is relevant to what John Dunn was talking about, and the maintenance in a sustained way of meta-awareness without it sort of occupying bandwidth may be a more non-propositional, non-verbal form of meta-awareness. And I would say that in highly experienced practitioners, it does not depend upon the simplicity of the formal practice, but it's something that is infused in every nook and cranny of everyday life, no matter how complex that situation is. So it does not depend on some kind of reduction of complexity. So that's just a point. But the question that I have is about the translational dissociations, which is extremely interesting. And you gave the example of someone blurting out, I'm not experiencing anger in an angry way. And my question to you is, how do you know that they're having meta-awareness at that time?
Well, so in some level, it's a definitional thing. So if you are saying, I'm not angry, that is a statement of meta-awareness. You are characterizing your state of being at that particular time. What I'm arguing is that they're having, by virtue of the fact that they're saying that they're meta-aware, they're saying I'm not angry, they have reflected on what their experience is sufficiently to say, I'm not angry. But absolutely, the kind of meta-awareness that they're having when they're shouting, I'm not angry, is a far cry from the kind of meta-awareness that they might have if they were to really sit deeply with their experience and take stock of it. So it's definitionally meta-awareness because they are commenting on the content of their own mind, but it's not a very deep kind of meta-awareness, and in this sense inaccurate.
Might you say that they're attempting meta-awareness in some sense, but may not actually be recognizing meta-awareness just because they're talking about their experience doesn't mean that they're necessarily instantiating meta-awareness, so to speak.
I think the challenge with going that route is that you're basically saying that meta-awareness is only meta-aware when it's completely accurate or something like that. So it becomes, you start to operationalize meta-awareness in terms of the success of it, which I think you could I think you'd want another term for that. Other cases, for example, in the research on repressors, they're engaging in, they are really sort of reflecting on their experience and still seeming to show no awareness of the experience. And in some of these other cases, for example, with the strawberry jams, when people analyze why they felt the way they did about the jams, and then that led them to choose ones that were less. Let me give you another example, actually. In one study, we showed people posters, and then in one case, we asked them to analyze why they felt the way they did about the different posters, and then to choose one. And the people who analyzed why they felt the way they did actually ended up choosing posters that they were less happy with later on. So somehow, in the process of coming up with this story for why they liked this poster and not that poster, they ended up creating this narrative that ended up leading them to choose posters they ended up not being happy with. So I do think that there are some cases where people are really trying to get it right and still missing it, although there are other interpretations of that.
Yeah, well, we can discuss that later. I want to just mention one final little story that you'd appreciate. A friend of mine, very inspired by your work, was writing a dissertation, this was at Harvard, and put in some gibberish in the discussion section, and not a single member of their committee detected that gibberish.
I love that, yeah.
That's not mind wandering, that's laziness. Thank you very much. We're going to have one more question from one of our faculty, and then I'm going to be picking a few questions from our participants. And please forgive me for whatever oversight I may be guilty of. We have more than 100 questions that have come in so far. So Alyssa Eppel was very curious about some practical and social implications of this work, especially in regard to empathy. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Al. Welcome everyone from Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. Jonathan, thank you so much for this phenomenal work, just so careful, meticulous with how you study conscious states. And so my question goes back to the opening comment that one of the comments that John Dunn said, which is there's nothing as practical and urgent to understand as attention and awareness and metacognition right now in our world. So I'm going to ask you to apply, you probably have data on this, how does, let's say, improvements or enhanced metacognitive awareness relate to our skill or ability for intersubjective awareness? For example, we know that if we are in touch and knowing our own mind, body sensations, feelings, we can better be empathic and know others. Now that's a crude global comment, and I'm wondering how this might relate to any measures you have of metacognition and any social correlates like empathy or social behavior?
That's a great question, and my first response is, yeah, let's collaborate on that. I don't really know. There have been sort of correlational studies where you, for example, look at contemplative practices and you see increases both in empathy and also in meta-awareness. But establishing the causal link, I'm not personally familiar of any studies that have established a causal link, but it makes complete sense that it should be very powerful, because as you become better able to recognize your own experiences, then you can apply that to recognizing other experiences. And even the meta-aware state is a state of recognition of the value of taking stock in experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
Mm-hmm.
it is a wonderful question, and one that deserves investigation. Unfortunately, sort of historically, what happens is psychology sort of got divided up into different camps. And so there's sort of the cognitive side, which looks at things like attention as it relates to mind wandering, and then you have the social side and the clinical side, and they haven't really been as well integrated as they can. And that's one of the many very exciting things about contemplative science, because it really does attempt to take the various different sides that have been sort of studied in isolation and begin to investigate them simultaneously.
Yes. And related to that, maybe the question isn't so general about, you know, is meta awareness ability going to be related to these kind of social perception and connectivity? Because you've also pointed out meta awareness of what? There are many different processes you're studying. So it's just like asking, is mindfulness, you know, with all of its different components related to X? So maybe that's not even the right question to start with, but rather, you know, is it metacognition about our emotional state that's most important for us to be more, you know, attuned and connected to others, or feel less threatened. I mean, I think social threat is kind of a theme we'll want to bring in and test the relevance of othering versus belonging and connection to all these aspects of attentional processes.
Yes, and I would also say, though, that I think that although, as I mentioned, meta-awareness, you can be meta-aware of one thing and not meta-aware of something else, I think the practice of checking in and taking stock of experience is likely to generalize over it. And we found that, for example, it correlates not only with people's noticing mind wandering, but the mindfulness practice also led people to be better able to be calibrated in terms of their confidence, so that they be better able to know if they were accurate or inaccurate on a perceptual discrimination task. So it does seem to sort of have a generalization of quality, but exploring that generalization, I think, is a really pressing question, even more so now.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you both. One question that's come up, and maybe this is more clarification, Jonathan, because I know you touched on it in your talk, but several people have been asking about, does it make sense to talk about meta-awareness of meta-awareness, meta-awareness?
Well, yeah, so you're just doing meta-awareness right now. There is this, whenever you go meta, there's always the risk of the infinite regress, because now we got to do meta-awareness, and now meta, and so on. And it can get dizzying when you do that. This is a situation where I actually think the cognitive limitations and constraints of our capacity is helpful. So I can do meta-awareness. We're kind of doing that right now, but 3 out, and then that's, my brain just can't, I can't do meta awareness. My brain just isn't able to sort of hold that. So I think there's sort of a natural constraint to it, but I think it is useful to think about sort of how are you fostering your meta awareness? And that would be meta awareness. So I think that maybe one step out, one or two metas out is about as far as I can go, but I think two metas out is useful.
Could I jump in there for a second, Al, and just
Sure.
say that because you know, there are actually different perspectives on this issue, and one claim would be you actually can't do meta awareness, because all you're doing when you do meta awareness is you've done meta awareness about, let's say, oh, I've reflected, now I've done this explicit moment, I'm bored, and then I do a meta awareness around, oh, I was noticing that I was bored. But actually all I've done is I'm just redirecting my attention to the current contents of thought, which was just still a second level thought. So it's not really that I'm doing a higher level thought about a higher level. In other words, the mechanism is always really just about whatever is the current contents being presented. So the meta awareness really, in the way we talked about it, is like serial, right? It's not, doesn't happen all at the same time. Like I noticed I'm bored, and then I noticed that I was noticing that I'm bored. So it's actually a sequence. So I think there's an argument to be made against the idea of the intelligibility of meta awareness. And this depends a lot on whether you accept something that we call higher order theories of consciousness, but we won't get into that.
Yeah, thank you, John. I want to make sure that we also get a chance to address some questions that are coming in from our Spanish and Portuguese participants. One of them has to do with something in a paper of yours, Jonathan, in which, and this is, I take it a quote from that paper, where you wrote, a person who becomes meta-aware during a pleasurable experience may actually enjoy it less than a person who is not explicitly monitoring his or her state. So could you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. We actually did a study where we had people, well, let me help give you sort of the intuition here. There used to be this expression, are we having fun yet? And there is this sort of intuition, which is that if you're monitoring your experiences as opposed to being completely engaged in it, that can be problematic. And we did a study in which we had people listen to a hedonically somewhat challenging musical piece, Stravinsky's Rites of Spring, which is, if you're familiar with it, it's a bit challenging. And in one case, we had them listen to it with the explicit instructions to pay attention to how happy it was making them. And in the other case, we simply had them listen to it without trying to monitor their happiness. And we found that when they were monitoring their happiness, they ended up not becoming happy from the music. So this constantly checking in, am I having fun yet? Am I having fun yet? Particularly if it's pleasurable but a little bit ambiguous, seems to be a situation where we can actually spoil the fun.
Thank you, thank you. Another question, this comes from one of our Spanish-speaking participants, has to do with what evidence there is that shows that there are actually different types of meta-awareness, say verbal versus nonverbal, precise versus biased. Can you say something more about that?
Yeah, well, in the paper that John and I wrote, we specifically pointed out that more research is needed to flesh out this the non-propositional meta-awareness. But certainly, as the examples that Richie was talking about, practice contemplatives seem to be able to sustain meta-awareness all the time. So there seems to be that important data point of just what happens when people have really focused on attending to their experience over a long period of time, and to what degree are they able to maintain a continuous awareness. Research on lucid dreaming also shows that people are able to know that they're dreaming and sustain the knowledge that they're dreaming for a significant period of time. But it's really, we think, an open area of research, and people who really have not been focusing sufficiently on this important area. And So I'm excited to see research going forward that can flesh out the non-propositional continuous mindful meta-awareness more. John, did you want to comment any further on that?
No, I think that, what you see, I would just really also mention that there's even some fairly old ideas like James's idea of fringe consciousness, which is the sense of kind of being aware of, even while you're focused on something, kind of being aware of the context of the object, in which the way in which the object is being presented, that there, and also another term is noetic feeling that's also been used. In other words, some sense of which something is familiar to you, like a tip of the tongue type of experience. And so the information that's being presented to you is being presented to you in a different way because of the frame, the kind of affective frame that's being used to present it. So there are actually existing ideas already out there that kind of move in this direction, not just lucid dreaming, but other ideas. And I think it's a matter in some ways of bringing some of this research together, actually.
Thank you, John. We're getting close to the end of our time for Q&A, and I'm skipping over some questions that I know would require much lengthier response. So let me choose one from a participant who's concerned about whether this verbal inner voice that might be present during a self-caught mind wandering could be an artifact of the fundamentally verbal task that the person is doing, that is a reading task. Jonathan?
That's a great question. We have used the paradigm with other types of tasks that are less verbal. For example, where they're just pressing a button. There's something known as the SART, where you have to press a button every time you see a number, unless it's a 3, and if it's a 3, you have to withhold it. So it's still, in some sense, a little bit verbal, but far less than a reading task numbers, and they don't really have to. They could be doing it just with the imagery. But I think that it's a good observation that in experimental research, we have to try to constrain the situation in particular ways, and we may inadvertently introduce elements to the task that may cause it to characterize in ways that we weren't necessarily anticipating. So it would be very interesting to explore how these types of tasks play out with truly nonverbal experiences, maybe some type of visual imagery type of thing. So it's a great and very perceptive question.
Thank you. And thank you so much again, Jonathan, for just a really enlightening presentation and done with such clarity. Apologies again to so many questions we couldn't get to, but some of them I know are going to relate to our afternoon and some of what we'll talk about tomorrow. So this isn't the last chance. We'll be getting back to it, and we'll be having a general panel discussion at the end. For right now, we're going to have a 15-minute break. And then at 10:45 Mountain Time, Roshi Joan is going to guide us in a meditation practice, and we'll be resuming our morning session then.
And then our good friend, Jay Garfield, will be jumping us into Zen Master Dogen, Gabyo, painted rice cakes, and illusory reality. Jay, we're looking forward to you raising the curtain on our subjective experience.
Thanks,
we'll
Roshi.
see you in 15 minutes, friends. Thank you so much, everybody.
Wonderful.
And please do take a stretch break, and our translators, thank you.